Great, great. It's so wonderful to see everybody. It's been such a long time since our last book club event. We took a bit of a break. When WildChina online events hit like 100 episodes throughout the pandemic. We went one every week, and then after it hit 100, we're like, okay, we need a little breather, and everyone was getting back to a normal pace of life. But it's so great to see everybody back online to join us. Those old friends already know me. New friends, I'm Zhang Mei. I'm the founder of WildChina. It is a China travel and event management company in Beijing, Shanghai, and Chengdu, Guangdong, a few locations. And as you can imagine, we came out of pandemic battered, seriously battered and malnourished. So thankfully, throughout the past 2-3 years, we've had these great, just wonderful intellectuals, scholars and writers who joined us for all these online events and giving us nutrition. And I'm so grateful also for all the clients who've stayed with us. Quite a few are actually returning to China this year. I'm delighted to let you know. And my colleagues, my goodness, on the ground in China, we've learned one word, not COVID, pivot. And we're like, okay, this is our survival mantra, pivot. And so we've pivoted again. So we're here and opened our door for business. Well, it actually stayed open the whole time. So I'm deeply grateful for all of you coming back to join us again. I don't know if you see Adam in the very first screen. So this is our guest of honor this evening, the author of this wonderful book, Fragile Cargo, the World War II Race to Save the Treasures of China's Forbidden City. And I'm sure a lot of you, most of you probably have been to the Forbidden City, but this is the untold story behind all those wonderful treasures. And actually quite some of the treasures are in Taipei. We'll get to that in a little bit. So let me say a few words about Adam. Adam and I actually met each other many years ago in Beijing when he was a Beijing correspondent for the BBC. And I've always admired his reporting on TV. Whatever was happening, you can see him right there. And Adam was born in Canada, grew up in the UK, and now lives in Washington, D.C. area. And he spent over 25 years in journalism, working mostly for BBC and mainly in Jakarta, Beijing, and DC. These all sound like very fun assignments and locations, but beyond these, he also covered Iraq and Afghanistan. So I'm sure there are many other stories there. And I think I remember seeing you wearing one of those bulletproof jacket on TV as well, some time ago. The book cover, actually, this book covers a different war zone. And I read this book in 2 days, as I was mentioning before we formally started, cover to cover, and just it's riveting. I have so many questions, but we'll get going. Adam, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real privilege to be here.
Thank you. And congratulations for writing this wonderful book. And I know you have many other books out there as well. So before I go into my questions, since you are probably doing lots of book talks, I think I should just give the floor to you. And I know you have some images that talked about the stories from the book. And I don't know how much you can reveal without sort of ruining the book's suspense for the audience, but I'll leave that to your judgment. Maybe you can help us set the scene of the book.
Yeah, absolutely. So Fragile Cargo is a book obviously about art. It's about the curators who conserved the art of the Forbidden City during the Second World War on this extraordinary journey around World War II China. But I hope it's also a little bit more than that. I'm kind of aiming to make it a little bit, I want it also to be a book about China's 20th century history and the extraordinary transformations that China went through in the 20th century. And I wanted also to be about China's World War II, which is, I think, a topic that we in the Anglophone world have sort of discarded strangely, or sort of memory hold or something. We don't really understand, and we don't represent or pay attention to China's Second World War in the way that we do so many other Second World War stories. So it's my attempt to try and do a little bit of uncovering of that history for the very general reader, and perhaps for the person who's only just starting to read about China. But just to give you an overview of the story itself, just so we've got something to, so we know what we're talking about. I'm going to go to a couple of images here. Bear with me 1 second. There we are, let's start here. This is an image of the southern gate of the Forbidden City, the Meridian Gate, taken in 1900, just before the end of the Qing Empire. Just take a look at the state that it's in. It's in terrible shape. Look at these weeds growing up through the cobblestones. Look at the great chunks of the walls falling apart, bits of the roof falling off. The whole place is falling to bits. Behind these walls lies the Forbidden City. The Forbidden City is the inner sanctum of the larger imperial city. It's the place where the emperors and their households of the Ming Empire and the Qing Empire lived from the 15th century through to the early 20th century. And only the emperor's household was permitted to live and move freely inside the Forbidden City behind these walls. And also behind these walls lay a vast collection of art, many different kinds of art, not a collection in the way that Europeans or Americans would think about art necessarily. This was very, very various. It was paintings, it was ancient bronzes, it was musical instruments, it was carvings in jade, it was suits of armor, clocks, thrones, encyclopedias, genealogies, jewelry, tapestries. It was this huge amalgam of objects that had multiple different functions. Some of it was decorative, some of it was ritual, some of it was functional. A lot of the porcelain, people actually ate off it, or it was used in Buddhist ceremonies or Confucian rituals. So it was a vast collection of objects with many, many different purposes and uses. 1924, the warlord Feng Yuxiang takes Peking and he bursts into the Forbidden City and he throws out the last emperor of China, Pu Yi, and his household. And now, in November 1924, the palaces are empty. For the first time since the 15th century, there's nobody in there. There's no imperial household, there's nothing. There's just empty, silent, echoing palaces and this vast collection of art. And in November 1924, December 1924, teams go in to these silent, echoing palaces and they begin cataloging and counting all the art that's inside in an attempt to get a handle on exactly what is inside these palaces. This image gives you some sense of what that effort was like. These are inventory teams going through documents and texts and books in one of the hundreds and hundreds of storehouses throughout the Forbidden City. It just gives you a sense of what that remarkable cataloging effort was like. Over the course of a year, the inventory teams cataloged 1.17 million objects and texts in a catalog, a formal catalog of the imperial collections that ran to 28 volumes. What sort of things did they find? Much of the art in there, most of the art in there, had never been seen by people outside of the imperial household. Secrecy and hiddenness were a very important part of the emperor's mystique. And so much of the art that these inventory teams found was stuff that they didn't know existed even. It was paintings like this one. I deal with this painting quite a bit in the book. I follow it on the journey all around China. It's a painting called Early Snow on the River. In Chinese, it's Jiangxing Chuxue Tu. It's a painting from the Southern Tang Kingdom, painted about 1100 years ago, ink on silk. This is a detail. It's a long, long hand scroll detailing life on a river in eastern China and the life of fishermen in the 10th century. It's a very, very beautiful very expressive, very generous, sort of humanistic portrait of life in 10th century China. The fishermen are in a cold snap. The weather is cold. It's dusted with snow. They huddle in their huts and everyone's trying to keep warm. There are travelers picking their way along a riverbank. It's an absolutely gorgeous piece of Chinese landscape painting. It's covered in imperial seals. It was in the imperial collections for a long time. They found paintings like this. Nature painting, this time no people, nothing of humanity to be seen at all. Just an extraordinary anatomical study of deer in a maple forest. This is herd of deer in an autumn grove. From about the same time, about 1,000 years ago, or also ink on silk. This was painted probably in the Liao Empire, that from Central Asia through contemporary Mongolia, southern Russia, over to the sea. A very, very beautiful, incredibly closely observed study of deer. One of the greatest paintings of the entire Chinese tradition. This was also one that they found inside the city. They found mountains and mountains of porcelain. This is a ewer, a little jug. It's called a monk's cap ewer. From the Ming period, from the reign of Xuande in the 15th century. But what's remarkable about this piece of porcelain is not just the beautiful porcelain, it's this extraordinary red glaze, which is a copper red glaze, vanishingly rare, only made for about 20 years under the Xuande emperor in the middle of the Ming period. It's incredibly difficult to achieve this red glaze. You have to use copper oxide in the glaze. You have to have perfect conditions in the kiln. Perfect temperature, has to be fired in reduction with no oxygen inside the kiln. And it's extremely difficult to achieve. And for every successful firing of a piece of porcelain with this glaze, they would fail on hundreds and hundreds of pieces that would be thrown away and smashed. So this copper red glaze from the Ming period is vanishingly rare and is today colossally valuable. Here's the process you see from the early 1930s, where it was decided that given the advance of the Japanese army into China, that the contents of the Forbidden City, now the Palace Museum by this time, would be packed and evacuated from Peking. By this time, when you see these guys packing up these wooden cases here, the Japanese military was only about 4 hours away from Peking. They were just to the north by the Great Wall. Japanese aircraft were flying overhead. The Japanese had already bombed Shanghai in 1932. They'd taken Manchuria in 1931. China was being ingested by the Japanese. And the threat from the Japanese military, the threat of air raid, the threat of plunder was so great that the Forbidden City took the decision to evacuate the finest parts of the imperial collections. And they packed up about 250,000 objects and texts, depending on how you count it, into 20,000 wooden cases like this. Actually 19,557. Most of those came from the Forbidden City itself. Some of them came from other museums around Peking. And in 1933, they began shipping these 20,000 wooden cases out of Peking. Here you see the cases being lined up inside the Forbidden City, waiting for transport. Porters carrying them around on shoulder poles and carts. From here, they were taken to the railway station in Peking, and 20,000 cases made their way first to Nanjing and then to Shanghai. And then for the next 16 years, these 20,000 wooden cases were moved all over China. They were moved as part of the huge migration that took place from Eastern China before the Japanese advance to the far west of China. One of the greatest migrations in human history, right? About 100 million people fleeing the Japanese and moving to the far west of China. The government of the Republic of China moved. Chiang Kai-shek's government moved. The KMT moved. Universities moved to the west of China. Schools, factories, and tens of millions of people. And the imperial art collections packed up in these cases moved with them as part of the larger effort to preserve the idea of a sovereign, independent China. Bear in mind here, it's important to remember that in China's Second World War, the Second World War in Asia, the Republic of China under Chiang Kai-shek and the KMT, imperfect, often grotesque as this regime was, it was the only nation state that did not capitulate to the Japanese Empire. It was the only nation state that held out against the Japanese. Everywhere else fell apart. The British Empire capitulated, lost Burma, Malaya, Singapore, and Hong Kong. The Dutch Empire capitulated, lost Indonesia. French Indochina was handed over to the Japanese. Everywhere else fell apart before the Japanese advance. But this extraordinary effort by the Republic of China to conserve itself was remarkably successful in its way. And they did it by migrating from the east of China to China's far, far west, to safety here in Sichuan province in the far west. This map shows you the route that these 20,000 wooden cases took between 1933 and 1945. They moved from Peking first down to Nanjing, then to Shanghai, and then they went in 3 routes. From here, the first group of cases came along the Yangtze River, way down south into Guangxi province, and then up into Guizhou province. And they were stored in a cave here in this town of Anshun, just outside Guiyang, where they stayed for 7 years under the eyes of a curator named Zhuang Yan, who looked after them and guarded them and conserved the art in those cases. The second group of cases, 9,000 cases, made their way the whole way up the Yangtze River to the wartime capital of Chongqing, then through the 3 gorges, up through Yibin, and they finally made their way up the Min River to Leshan, just outside Leshan here. That took nearly 2 years, that trip. The third group of cases, 7,000 cases, made their way by rail the whole way up here across northwestern China into Shanxi province up to Baoji here. From here, they went by truck over the Qinling Mountains, the highest mountain range in China outside Xinjiang and Tibet. 12,000 feet in winter over switchback passes on the back of lorries and trucks. And they came down, down, down into Sichuan province, and they ended up here at Ermei, at the foot of Ermei Shan, the sacred Buddhist mountain. On these routes, they went by steamship on the rivers, they went by truck, they went by rail, they went on the backs of porters sometimes. Sometimes they went on bamboo rafts. Here's an image of trucks loaded with cases containing the imperial art being poled across a river in Sichuan by boatmen with these bamboo poles pushing the trucks across the river. It was a phenomenally complicated, difficult process, and it was beset at every turn by Japanese bombing, by terrible roads, by uncooperative steamship owners and in the railways, and there was constant shortage of gasoline, constant shortage of trucks, shortage of food. It was improvised, uncertain. It was really an appalling series of journeys, and I go into some detail in the book about how this all went. The main character in my book is a man named Ma Heng. That's him. He was the director of the Palace Museum from 1934 on, and he was the guy who oversaw this extraordinary journey. 16 years he committed to safeguarding and protecting this effort of conserving the imperial collections. a quiet, retiring scholar from Peking University, an expert in epigraphy and philology and ancient inscriptions and archaeology. A significant scholar in his own right. But perhaps his greatest achievement was this extraordinary act of conservation in World War II. And of course, at the end of the war in 1945, these 20,000 cases had to come the whole way back across China, which took another 2 years bringing them back to Nanjing. And as that happened, China, of course, was falling back into civil war. The Republic of China was collapsing. The communists were moving in the north. The writing was on the wall for Chiang Kai-shek and his regime. And in late 1948, it was decided that the Republic of China, Chiang Kai-shek, his military, his government, and China's entire gold bullion reserve would flee to Taiwan. And Chiang Kai-shek ordered that the very finest pieces of the imperial collections would go with him from mainland China to Taiwan. So 3,000 cases of the very finest art from the imperial collections made its way to Taiwan in 1949 in another whole series of strange and incredibly difficult journeys. And of course, that art remains in Taipei today, and it forms the core of the Palace Museum, Taipei. So at that point in 1949, these imperial collections that had been in the Forbidden City in Peking for hundreds of years and had been so expanded and built out by the Qing emperors, particularly Qianlong, and had made this extraordinary journey for 16 years all over China through the war, and have remained remarkably intact. In 1949, the collections are split. They're split between Taipei, Nanjing, and Beijing, and they remain split today. And so the original imperial collections have never been reconstituted in their original situation in Peking. So I'm going to leave it there, and Mei, I'll go back to you and we can pick it up there and expand on whatever bits of that you would like to expand on.
Yeah, thank you, Adam. The map, the journey just took me immediately all the way back in the book. And I've been to Anshun, I've been to Leshan, that area. And this time of the year, it's like damp and cold, and no, Glenn has been to Baoji. So you can all completely visualize what those locations are today and what they were like back then. What struck me as I was reading was like the conditions were just terrible, to put it simply. It's cold, it's dangerous, and they were moving and on these ships. And you built the book somehow. These characters, they come out so alive. I feel like I got to know each one of them. So what was going through your mind? Did you put yourself in the character's shoe and think, what were they thinking to sacrifice their decades or lives to protect these?
Yeah, it was one of the things about writing the story was, when either as a journalist or a writer of nonfiction, when you come across a really interesting story, you kind of assume that there are going to be holes in the story, there are going to be gaps, and you're going to have to do a lot of repair work, But the closer I got to this story, the better it got. And there was a remarkable amount of very granular, very rich material in Chinese. And the most important material was memoir written by these curators, two in particular, a man named Zhuang Yan, who was the young archaeologist from Peking University, and another man named Na Zhiliang, who was a specialist in jade and a curator in the Forbidden City. And they both wrote very beautiful, very personal memoirs with lots of texture and lots of description of their lives at the time. And they wrote it in lovely, breezy, vernacular Chinese that was not too hard to read. And as I dived into these memoirs, these men just kind of came alive. very moving, intimate descriptions of their lives of a sort that I have not seen very often in kind of Chinese writing. And their humor and their generosity and their commitment just sort of shines through. And they're very honest about themselves and their shortcomings and the difficulties of the journey. Na Zhiliang is he's a rather stocky, square-faced guy. He's extremely physically and psychologically strong. He's rather hard-headed. And this serves him extremely well through the war years. He's emotionally resilient. He's able to find pleasure in the moment. He's always writing, even in these appalling conditions with Japanese bombers overhead and, terrible disease wherever you look. Wartime China was beset by dysentery, cholera, typhus, just awful conditions, absolute penury, shortages of food. They weren't getting their salaries on time. It's raining. There are bombers. It's like, it's ghastly. But Na Zhiliang is always able to write in his memoir, it was a miserable day, but that evening we found this little restaurant where they served braised carp and a rather nice fine fun liqueur, and we were able to sit down and just have a lovely evening talking. And he's always giving you these little anecdotes of how and then we found a market where they were selling a particular kind of bean curd that we took back to our, and we cooked it up and it was absolutely delicious. And so you're always getting these little moments of pleasure and little tiny insights into his life where and you can see how resilient he is. And that's, in wartime and in a war zone where you've got somebody who is decisive and cheerful in that way. That's the kind of guy that you want to be around, right, in those kind of awful circumstances. Zhuang Yan, the archaeologist, is much more thoughtful and much more skeptical, and I think was probably more deeply affected by his experiences. He's extremely considered, and he's a small man, rather slight, with big glasses. And he has a lovely wife named Shen Ruoxia, who is a musician. She plays the flute. And he is always worrying. He's a worrier, and he's concerned about any number of things all the time, but he's extremely articulate and expressive about how he's feeling. So on that level, the memoirs just kind of came to life, and there are other accounts too that contain this wonderful detail. So on some level, I was really just sort of rendering these people's characters rather than having to interpret them, because it was just sort of all there, really.
Well, so that puts in my head a question of you didn't go out looking for these books, or did they just fall into your lap? Was there like a series of incidents that led you to this idea? And now some of you may know I'm a PhD student at UC Berkeley, and the professor's constantly like, what is your research question? And so was there a moment, was there a central question that started begging you to answer it in your head somewhere to start you on this journey to write this book? Was there a series of events that led to this?
Yeah. I mean, we heard about the story. My wife and I heard about the story from Taiwan. We neither were very familiar with it at all. We literally sat down one evening about 10 years ago and Googled it in English to find that there was very, very little material in English on the story. There was one chapter in one book and a couple of academic articles. And the story had never really been told fully in English. And as I looked into it more and more, I found that these new primary sources were emerging in China. Stuff was coming out of archives. There were some new books being published in Chinese that were giving all this wonderful detail. And it was just a great piece of timing for someone like me, a journalist come kind of commercial writer. A story like this falls into your lap maybe once or twice in a career. It's kind of, it's rare. And so I felt that perhaps I was in a position to give it a shot. I had a lot of help. I went to historians, I went to art historians. I hired a researcher in China to help me sift through the primary sources, to find the most reliable of them, and then began to piece it all together. But the question that you're talking about, the moment of realization for me really was coming to understand the scale of the story, 20,000 cases moving over 16 years. But it was also the backdrop. It was the canvas against which the story took place. And I came to understand more about the scale and the scope of World War II in China, and the strange kind of flawed achievements of the Republic of China during that time. And it was that, for me, it was suddenly I found myself wanting to tell the story of the art, but I wanted to tell it against the backdrop of this wartime kind of canvas, in an attempt to sort of uncover some of that wartime history that I feel we have forgotten in the West, and that we don't understand. Yeah.
Yeah, I can see that. And just for everyone in the room, I have a whole list of questions but they are kind of geared more towards my personal interest in how the craft of how you pull these characters and structures together. So I'm going to continue going, but I want to give you a heads up. If you have any particular questions for Adam, please either use the raise your hand function or type in the chat box. I'll try to get to them quickly. So while you're thinking about the question, I'll continue on this, Adam, is precisely what I was mentioning, the characters. How did you come down to like, these are the few individuals, or did you already know about the three routes? How did you decide to structure the book? Did you have to struggle?
Well, I mean, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
No, I didn't. Again, I wish I could tell you that it was this hugely complex task, but the fact is the chronology was there. So one of the curators, a man named Ouyang Daoda, who was this very starchy disciplinarian guy, he was like he was the toughest of the curators, and I think my sense is he was responsible for really keeping discipline strong among all the curators in the entire effort. He wrote a full chronology of events in 1950. After the whole story was over in 1950, he sat down and he wrote an 80,000 word handwritten manuscript laying out from 1934 to 1949 everything that happened: dates, places, names, numbers, tables, lists of every piece that got broken along the way. There are all these tables, and his thoughts about what was going on at the time. Very clinical, rather cold writing, not very insightful or warm, but from an informational perspective, just perfect. And then in 1950, after he'd written this thing, the manuscript got lost. Nobody knew what had happened to it. For 56 years, nobody knew where it was. And then in 2006, someone in the Forbidden City in Beijing found the original handwritten manuscript sitting on a shelf in a storeroom somewhere in the Forbidden City. And it was published by a Chinese publisher in 2010. So nobody had sort of read this thing, as far as I can tell. Certainly outside China, nobody had read this book. It hadn't been looked at, and there'd been no treatment of it by scholars or academia outside China. So I think I was pretty much the first person to get to grips with that chronology of the entire story. But the whole thing was right there. He just laid it out. So it wasn't that hard to structure. In non-fiction writing, everybody always talks about the tyranny of chronology, and you can structure books in different ways. But it just appeared to me that it was so chronologically, the story unfolded so powerfully and in such a meaningful way that there was no reason not to do it chronologically. So there it was, and it was all structured, and I could then lay that chronology against the other memoirs of other curators and just piece them all together. And then other primary sources started popping up. The number 2 archive in Nanjing, which is the big wartime historical archive where all the wartime archives are kept, started publishing documents in their journal. They started digging up bureaucratic documents from the time. detailing all sorts of details about the story. And they just published it, and suddenly I started finding this stuff online in 2017, 2018. It was just popping up online. These wonderful Chinese online databases that you can use, CNKI and Duxiu and other ones, vast amounts of material in there. So yeah, the structure was relatively clear. The story in some ways just kind of told itself.
Okay, well, you made it sound simple. I'm pretty sure it's not that easy. One last question on how, and then we'll go to all the questions in the chat. Research. How much of it was secondary research from, I think you alluded to quite a few of these memoirs and then publications that just came out over the years. What primary resource did you get to? Did you get to speak to any of the relatives of these characters? Did you go visit these art pieces in various locations in Taipei or in Beijing? Well, I knew you were in Beijing, but tell us more.
So the story itself, the detail around the story itself, all comes from Chinese language primary sources: memoir, original documents, and Ouyang Daoda's chronology. Those are the primary sources. The larger history, I'm not a historian. I'm a commercial writer, so I relied very heavily on secondary sources for the larger history, and I relied on historians to help me get that right. I went to Taipei several times, to the Palace Museum Taipei, who were wonderful and incredibly open and helpful with their material, and they pointed me towards important materials. And I was able to interview, in Taiwan, I was able to interview 2 surviving eyewitnesses. One of them was the son of the curator Zhuang Yan, who was 87 years old when I interviewed him. He was able to tell me he was a child at the time with his father, traveling all the way to Sichuan, out there living in these little villages, to Guizhou, living in these villages in Guizhou, remembering his father's working to conserve the art while they were out there in rural China, remembering the war, giving me details about the house they lived in, what they ate, where they slept, his childhood memories and memories of his parents, which was just glorious. It was lovely. And his memories really flesh out the sort of central part of the story. And I was able to interview another man named Suo Yuming, who was a curator himself and was instrumental in getting some of the art from the mainland to Taiwan in 1949. And he was 100 years old when I interviewed him. He's sadly passed away since then, but I was able to talk to him with his family, and he walked me through the process of the shipments from Nanjing to Taiwan in early 1949. Yeah. And what that was like. He was a young curator at the time. So that suddenly brought me kind of emotionally and psychologically much closer to the story, and brought it obviously much more to life. And I hope that sort of made its way into the pages. I certainly wanted it to do so. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Just curious, I think you may have mentioned the son in the book. Don't remember clearly. Is he also in art and curation? The 87-year-old son.
He's a photographer. His name is Zhuang Ling. He's a photographer. He's a rather wonderful, quite well-known photographer in Taiwan.
Okay.
And is an extraordinary man. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I loved the part of the family in Guizhou. It just, every time I opened the book, I felt like I was going to visit them. The lives out there. It's just very much alive. When they were out there in the far west of China during those war years, the cases moved to the far west and they stayed in their hiding places. They were hidden in caves, in temples, in ancestral halls, dotted around these little towns in Sichuan and Guizhou. And Zhuang Yan and his wife and the children in the village of Anshun. And the cases are stacked in a cave there. But obviously the art needs to be conserved.
all through these years. It's wet, it rains, the cave is damp, there are bugs, there are termites, there are moths. Zhuang Yan, the curator, has to prise open these wooden cases when the weather is warm, and he has to take out these incredibly fragile Song period landscape paintings and paintings like Early Snow on the River, Southern Town hand scrolls. And he has to dry them out. He has to hang them up from trees and let the air and the wind play on these paintings. They have to take out books and texts, and because if they don't, they get damp and mold grows in them, and the painting is ruined. If you get spores and mold into the silk fibers, the painting's completely ruined. So this process wasn't just lifting and moving these cases. It was conserving this incredibly fragile collection as well at the same time. And Zhuang Yan and Na Zhilian go on in their memoirs about how miserable it was doing the conservation, particularly protecting against bugs, against termites. They were terrified of termites. Termites can burrow their way through a wooden case. They eat cellulose, and they can burrow their way into books and paintings and just destroy. They can destroy these things. So the curators are on their knees and their elbows, crawling around day after day after day, searching for signs of termite infestation, month upon month, year after year. Every day they're on their hands and their knees checking for termites. And it's sort of that sort of process. And Zhuang Ling was able to give me his childhood reminiscences of watching his father pull these paintings out of these cases on sunny, warm days in Guizhou and hang them up, and watching them swaying in the breeze as he aired out these ancient paintings in a desperate attempt to keep them dry. And it was just lovely getting all that atmosphere and texture.
Yeah, no, I can totally see that. Okay, the questions in the chat room is piling up. The first question, I think from Summer: what motivates you to write the book? I think you alluded to some of this earlier. If you want to take that.
I mean, when a story like that turns up, and I felt that perhaps, I was equipped to do it a little bit. Maybe I sort of knew the contours of the history a bit. I mean, why wouldn't you? It was a wonderful, wonderful opportunity, and it was a fabulous experience doing it. I wouldn't have passed it up for anything. Yeah,
no, it's great. And Gloria, do you want to unmute yourself and come in and ask the question? Feel free to do that.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hello.
Yes.
Hi, Adam. Hi, Mei. I'm a really big fan of your book, and also I follow WildChina. Even it's not so much traveling in China right now, but finally this year we get started. Okay, my question is, would you please share one of the most impressive art pieces when you collect the resources, when you start to write your book, and why?
Right. Well, I mean, we talked about Early Snow on the River. We talked about the Monk's Cap Ewer. There's one other set of pieces that were incredibly important to the story. And these were these bizarre things called the stone drums of Qin. And these things are chunks of granite that had been in Beijing for 600 years. They were they're literally big chunks of rock. But the value of them is that they are inscribed with poetry. They were inscribed about 500 BC with poetry, and the poetry is written in characters or graphs that are immensely important because they were a sort of transitional phase between seal script and the clerical script that we recognize today. So the writing on these drums is of fantastic cultural significance. But because the granite was so old and had been so poorly treated over the centuries, it was beginning to flake off. The outside of the rock beginning to flake off, and the inscriptions were being lost. So even these were chunks of them, another bit of granite would flake off and you'd lose a bit more of the inscriptions. So how on earth were they going to pack these things and transport them? Well, Zhuang Yan figured out how to do it. And I go into some detail in the book about how he figured it out. but they ended up being the hardest, the heaviest, the most unwieldy, and perhaps the most fragile pieces that they took on the entire journey. 10 cases weighing half a ton each, with these incredibly fragile lumps of rock inside. And the story of the stone drums as they make their way all over China is really extraordinary. At one point, they're on the back of a truck, and they're driving from Chongqing through the mountains this is actually on their way back in 1946. And the stone drums are sitting on the back of these trucks. And a truck is going up a hillside, and it rounds a corner, and there's another vehicle coming around the corner, and the truck has to swerve, and it goes too close to the edge of the mountainside, and the wheels begin to go off the edge of the mountainside. The driver bails out, and the truck turns over and starts going down the side of the mountain. Now, the case containing the stone drum in the back falls out of the truck and lodges in rumbles away down the mountainside, hundreds of feet, and crashes into a river below. But the case with the stone drum in it is stuck in rocks halfway down the mountain, and the packing holds, the case doesn't break. And so the curators are stuck there on this mountainside, looking down at this case, and they have to get ropes and clamber down, and they have to haul it the whole way back. But stories like this abound throughout the entire trip, these ridiculous near misses that they have all the time, with trucks overturning and crashing, and rafts on rivers, breaking loose from their moorings. And I mean, it's just an absurd story of near misses. The whole way through, and the story of the stone drums are particularly trying for the curators the whole way through. Yeah.
Adam, the imageries, has Hollywood approached you yet? It's got to be a movie.
Oh, we live in hope.
Fantastic. Okay, Richard Sanger, would you want to ask your question? Okay, I'll read it. All right. So how did they decide what artwork should take to Taiwan? What happened to the art that was not taken to Taiwan?
Great question. All the selection of the art, both back in 1933 when they decided to leave Peking originally, and the selection that they made in 1949 to decide what would go to Taiwan. Of course, all these things are based on what those curators at the time deemed to be the most important pieces of art. So their tastes and their criteria were particular to them at the time. And one might, disagree with some of the choices that they made. But in 1949, the order came down from the Republic, from the office of Chiang Kai-shek, that the art, the very finest pieces, or what they deemed to be the finest pieces, would make their way to Taiwan. And the curators themselves, notably our guy, Zhuang Yan, the archaeologist that I've been talking about, he was among the curators that were ordered to select what were considered the flower of the imperial collections. And he did it. He was ordered to do it, and he did it. He made those selections. He selected all the great Song dynasty landscape paintings. He selected the finest Ming porcelain, the finest early Qing porcelain. He selected the Siku Quan Shu, the great Qianlong encyclopedia. He selected the Qing archive, the archive of the Qing Empire. That went to Taiwan. I think something like, I think it was 13,000 pieces of porcelain went. It must have been an appalling decision for him to have to take. I mean, he was dividing the imperial collections, and he was, in a ridiculously short period of time, making absurd decisions about what constituted great art and what constituted the center of the imperial collections. And then he was ripping these collections apart. So it was a very difficult, tense, I think very traumatic time for the curators in making those decisions. Yeah.
And what happened to the art that was not taken?
Oh, so the art that was not taken, which was most of it, some of it remained in Nanjing and is now on display in Nanjing. Most of it went back to its home in the Forbidden City in Beijing, and it's now back in the Palace Museum, Beijing, and you can see it back there. But some of what are undoubtedly the greatest pieces, particularly the Song landscapes by Fan Quan and Xia Gui, and the paintings by Ma Yuan, and this incredible porcelain, and the Suku Chuan Shu, the encyclopedia. These things all went to Taiwan and formed the core of the Palace Museum Taipei. Yeah.
Yeah. And we have a question from Tom Gold. Tom, would you like to unmute?
Sure. Hi, I look forward to reading the book. That fascinating story. There was a professor at Harvard named Francis Cleves who taught Mongol, Manchu, and classical Chinese. And there was a story, I don't know if it's true, how legendary, that he had carried a huge amount of books on his back, which became the core of the Harvard Yenjing collection. I'm not sure if it was all of those languages or one of them. And that would have been in the late 40s. I don't know if his name crossed your path at all in the course of researching the book.
It's not a name I recognize. I wonder where he got all those books. A lot of stuff left China at that time. It was very chaotic. A lot of art was leaving China, and a lot ended up in Japanese collections, obviously, and a lot ended up in European and American collections too. So yeah, people were carrying a lot of stuff out, but that's not a name I recognize, no.
Okay, good to see you, Tom. Now, next questions, Bruce Austin, old friend. You want to ask the question?
Hello, thank you for that, Mei. Adam, I'm loving your book. Thank you so much for writing this book. It's just fascinating. You've referenced several times forgotten history, and my question is around early in the book. You referenced kind of the provenance of this vast collection that was part of the Imperial Palace, that became the Imperial Palace collection. But in the early 1900s, following the Boxer Rebellion, apparently the Western powers decided they had to come into China to give the Chinese what for, and that they basically helped themselves to the collections of the Imperial Palace. You referenced the fact that one diplomat in particular filled up a train car. Where did all this art go, and has any of it been repatriated to China? That question probably is a silly question, but I was just curious about that.
So that was a particular moment. Westerners were plundering. Westerners were removing art from China all through the late 19th century and early 20th century by various different means. Some of it was sort of, legitimate. Chinese dealers would acquire art. Scouts for Western dealers would be in Beijing, and they would be notifying auction houses back in Paris and London and New York and over in Tokyo of what was coming onto the market in Beijing, and then people would buy it. And a lot of stuff left that way, in a way that was transparent, and there are receipts, and it was fine. Some of it not so much. 1860, with the British and French burning of the Summer Palace, a lot of art left then, but particularly after the Boxer uprising and the advance of the Allied armies on Peking in 1900, there was a great deal of plundering. It's not clear to me exactly how much left the inner sanctum of the Forbidden City right then, but an awful lot left Peking during that time. Soldiers would just kick down doors, kick their way into palaces, into temples, into private houses, and just load up their haversacks with stuff. The British regiments particularly were extremely efficient. The British regiments would acquire all the stuff that their soldiers had looted, and they would then hold what they called prize auctions. They would auction off the stuff, and the cash that the regiment made would be distributed throughout the regiment. So the soldiers would walk away with cash. Some of the most important art in Western Chinese art in Western museums came out of China in 1900 after the Boxer Uprising. The best example of that is at the British Museum, the Admonitions Scroll, which is one of the most important pieces in all of Chinese art. It's the earliest figure painting in Chinese art, ink on silk, and it lives now in the British Museum. That piece left Peking in 1900 and turned up in London in 1902 it was the property of a British Army captain, and he sold it to the British Museum, and it remains there today. And talking about this stuff is difficult. Museums don't like to, address the origins of a lot of this stuff. The greatest porcelain collection in Europe is in the British Museum too, the Percival David Foundation collection. That was material that was mortgaged by the Qing household in about 1900 or so to a bank as collateral against a loan, and it sat in the basement of a bank in Beijing. And then in 1927, Percival David, the great British collector, swooped, heard the stuff was there, came in, bought it from the bank, and took it back to the UK. So art left in all sorts of different ways. Some of it legitimate, some of it not so much. There are constant discussions about whether some of this art should go back, particularly art that really ought to be in situ. For example, friezes from Dunhuang, places like that were actually ripped out of caves and ripped off walls, perhaps have a slightly different status to just individual pieces of porcelain. I think it's an ongoing discussion, and I don't think it's going to be resolved anytime soon. Art historians and museums get pretty cagey when you start asking them about it and are reluctant to divulge what stage they're at. I've tried, and I don't. I haven't got had a lot of success in figuring out exactly where we are in those discussions about repatriation.
Yeah, thank you. We try to keep the event at exactly about an hour, and I think we're coming up to time. And I see there are two more questions. One about Ma Heng, what happened to him? I think we can skip that one because there's a chapter in the book at the very end, so you'd have to read the book.
Spoilers.
Maybe
yeah.
We'll quickly cover who financed, Miriam's question, who financed all this?
Great question. Some money came from the central government. It was never enough from the government of the Republic. A lot of funds came from what's called the British share of the Boxer Indemnity Fund, which was a large chunk of money that was Chinese reparations to the UK after the Boxer Uprising that kind of got returned to China. It's complicated, but the British sort of helped out a bit. One of the biggest problems they had was inflation ate away at funding the whole way through the war. And we get a real insight through this story into what really brought down the Republic of China and the role that inflation played in destroying Chiang Kai-shek's republic. We get to see it in granular detail how that worked by looking at the finances of the museum in the book. And I've tried to bring that whole story alive a bit. I hope it's worked.
Well, thank you. Thanks, everyone. This has been such a delightful conversation. And as you can tell from how Adam describes the truck hanging off the cliff, it feels literally like that when you read this book. The drama just keeps going. So if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. Go get it. It's called Fragile Cargo, the World War II Race to Save the Treasures of China's Forbidden City. And I know Adam has quite a few other books, and you can find all the information on adambrooks.com. Right? Is that the best way to stay in touch with you?
That's the best way to find me, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much. And for everyone interested, this podcast is recorded and will be uploaded. Well, this event will be turned into a podcast and uploaded onto the China Travel Podcast that's produced by WildChina. We have a few previous episodes there as well, so make sure you subscribe to that. And any last words you want to share with our audience, Adam, before we say goodbye?
No, not at all. Thank you very much for having me. And I hope the book does a little bit to contextualize modern Chinese history a little bit and to reawaken our understanding of these amazing transitions that China went through in the 20th century. That was my aim, and I hope it works for you.
Absolutely, it did for me. Thank you. Well, thank you, everyone. And we have our next book talk, March 22nd, 5 p.m. We'll be talking about Lu Xun. It's Eileen Chang's book, Wild Grass, Yecao. So we hope to, oops, oh, there it is. We hope to see many of you back then. All right. Thank you so much. And thank you, Adam. We will see you next book talk, and good luck with
Thank you so much, and
all
thank
your
you
book
for coming.
talks. Thanks, everyone. Old friends, new friends. See you next time.